Okay, welcome back. Here we are.
Pacific Legends. Unleashed.
And we're back for another exciting maritime story.
Yep, very keen for the series.
Yeah.
I think we both first read the book, I don't know, a year ago now, maybe longer.
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
Yeah, we've been fizzing at the bung.
Another one of Peter Fitzsimon's classics that got us into this story.
Yeah, so we've sort of referred to that as one of the main texts, plus Mike Dash's book, Batavia as well, Batavia's Graveyard, and those two texts, plus one of the protagonist's journals sort of form the literary backdrop for most of what we're going to say.
So why don't you tell us what this is all about, mate?
Well, it's a story about a ship. It's a story about a little bit of murder. It's got pretty much everything in it, to be honest. It's got treasure and wreck and disaster and disease and all the ingredients that you need for a proper barnstorming tale.
All my favourite things.
All your favourite things. And it's got a few twists and turns as well. A bunch of commentators, like the last podcast on the left guys, have done a series on this. And them and a bunch of others have said that this is a story that's crying out for like a really well-made, high-budget TV series.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, beggars belief that it hasn't been made already because it's an absolutely cracking yarn.
Yeah, nice.
But we're going to start with a little bit more of a mundane, inauspicious beginning.
Because we're going further back than we ever have in Pacific Legends Unleashed, aren't we?
Yeah, we probably are.
Yeah,
this is probably the earliest start.
Yeah, nice. So when are we talking? Give us some dates, mate.
Well, we'll talk about time and place to sort of set the stage for the events that follow. And we're going to start in the 16th and 17th century Europe, specifically focused on the Netherlands.
Oh.
But the Netherlands then were not exactly like the Netherlands now.
The freaky deaky Dutch.
Yeah, they were still freaky deaky. The Netherlands, or the Low Countries, as they were often referred to, were at the time ruled by the Habsburgs. So Philip II, the same man who was the king of Spain,
yes,
ruled over those 17 territories.
He was a bit of a boss back then, eh?
Yeah, a bit of a boss. He was very Catholic.
Yeah.
And so those territories as well were Catholic, just like the rest of Spain.
Yes.
So under that Spanish rule, those 17 provinces just sort of teetered along. But after a while, some of those provinces found themselves with a bit of an appetite for revolt against the Spanish. So against their overlords, by 1579 to 1581, 7 of those northern provinces had broken away from the majority, and they became known as the United Provinces of the Dutch Republic.
Sweet.
So throughout the story, we might talk a little bit about the United Provinces or the Dutch Republic, or just mentioning the Dutch. And when we do that, we're probably talking about those 7 provinces in the north.
And this is like Holland and Zeeland and all these things, eh?
Yeah, so Amsterdam sits there, and those territories to the south, and some of those cities like Antwerp and Bruges, so that's like Belgium and Luxembourg today.
Yeah.
So they're in the south, but those 7 northern provinces are really the backdrop for most of our story today. And it's not like that was just a flash in the pan either. Like that conflict that led to that sort of emancipation of the North is known now as the 80 Years' War. So it was a big deal.
Yeah.
It was a big deal, which was sort of glossing over. One of the reasons that they wanted to break away wasn't just for political independence. I mentioned that Spain was very Catholic. Yes. And those northern provinces, the Dutch Republic, wanted a bit of religious freedom as well as political freedom. They wanted to break away from Catholicism, and they were pretty keen on a type of Protestant doctrine called Calvinism.
Oh.
So, in some sense, it doesn't play a massive role in the story, but I think at the time, religion, and one of the characters in this story, the predicant, who we'll introduce a lot later on, plays a pretty important role in providing like a moral counterpoint to our arch villain. So it is kind of important to understand the religious leanings of the time, and how that sort of sets the stage, some of the motivations for the players in our story. As much as the North were keen on being Calvinist, though, Spain was less keen on that happening.
Yeah.
Like, we're getting towards the end of the Spanish Inquisition, but it wasn't as bad in the Low Countries as it was, back in Spain or in other areas of Europe, but it was still pretty intense. Like, you could be tortured, executed, like burned at the stake just for reading the wrong book or saying the wrong thing.
Yeah, yeah. Catholics.
Yeah, Calvinism was definitely a step away from that. And it's not that Calvinism's a religious free-for-all compared to Catholicism. It's not, but it is a little bit more free in terms of personal expression. It teaches that you can sort of learn truth and you can teach yourself from the Bible if you just read it.
And you can give the Pope the what for?
Yeah, you can give him the finger while you're reading the Bible because you don't need him anymore.
Mate.
Yeah, this strange man in white robes a million miles away, he's not the source of truth and good and righteousness for you anymore. You can do that yourself.
And this all comes from the Reformation from Martin Luther, right?
Yeah, totally.
A few hundred years before.
Yeah, and so that religious climate is a little bit more focused on the individual. It's less reliant on a system because Catholicism's pretty top-down in that sense. Like the Pope is the word of God and speaks through the church. And
he was pretty powerful.
Yeah, massive,
especially at that time.
Hugely powerful. So Calvinism broke away in a few key ways, and one of those is in the belief of predestination.
Oh, yeah?
So you can't just do good deeds to get yourself into heaven. God's already decided who the elect few are going to be.
That takes away a lot of motivation, doesn't it?
Well, kind of. There's a bit of a loophole that, well, it's not really a loophole, but in some ways our story does sort of depend on this technicality. Calvinists believed that you could get a bit of a hint as to whether or not you were going to be one of the chosen few who were saved, would live for all eternity in heaven, based on how well you did in normal life.
Oh, yeah. So
like
how was that measured?
Well, your worldly success on earth was a good indicator of...
Is this like how much money you make?
Yeah. I think...
Based on money?
Yeah, that was one way of measuring...
Your high school marks in the exams?
Yeah. How hot your girlfriend was.
Yeah, okay.
All that sort of stuff was taken into account. And so if you were absolutely killing it, then there's a good chance that you were set for eternal salvation.
But then it feels like if you're kind of battling away there, you're like, mate, I'm never going to
give up.
So I might as well just become a criminal.
End it all. Yeah, look, I'm not saying this is a perfect religious system. It still relies on a
Sky
Father.
Flaws in there, a few flaws.
Yeah, how unusual for religion.
The phones are lighting up, mate.
Anyway, I think like one of the key reasons that that's important, that idea of being able to judge your religious success or closeness to God by your material worldly success, that's important for our story because you're going to talk about, one of the first super corporations in the world.
Yes.
And maybe that's a bit of religious justification for their acts, going around and pillaging and otherwise exploiting every land and human resource that they possibly could.
Yeah.
Because
very thoughtful company.
Very godly of them to go and do all of those things.
Yeah.
Another key point to make is that, while the Dutch Republic, those united provinces, were at war with Spain and Portugal at the time were united under one crown. So the Dutch were also at war with Portugal. So those two countries on the Iberian Peninsula united against this little upstart group of 7 united provinces.
Tell you what, they'd have a good football team.
They would have a very good football team. Yeah. And so that's just something else to take into consideration because we're going to talk about the Portuguese a little bit. So Spain and Portugal.
Because they were a bit of a player in the age of exploration, weren't they?
Yeah, age of discovery for sure.
They were out there.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a couple of explorers who are sort of key to opening up India, that Indian Ocean route for Europe. But I guess just a little recap before we move on, because I've thrown a few names, places, dates, etc. out there.
Yeah.
Key points to understand, so these are the highlights to keep in mind. The Dutch Republic is a relatively new thing. It's heavily shaped by religious principles that encourage individuals within it to take ownership for their own lives and make some conscious choices about what they believe. That's a big difference to following the orthodoxy of the established, sort of doctrine of the time. One of the key factors motivating individuals in this society is the pursuit of worldly success.
Yeah.
And the best way to demonstrate worldly success in a nation which is at this point bursting with traders and shopkeepers and shipbuilders and all of those sorts of things is to turn a mean profit.
Oh, yeah. Love that.
That desire for individual worldly success, though, is somewhat hampered by the fact that the Dutch Republic is at war with Spain and Portugal. Tiny little republic at war with the might of those empires.
They've picked a fight with a big dog.
Yeah. And it's a really tricky situation to be in for individuals, but, for the nation itself. And it was something that was no doubt discussed at many dinner tables around the United Provinces while they hooked into their rotten meat.
Yum.
So that rotten meat's a bit of a segue into the next key part of the background, which is the spice trade.
Oh, yes.
Which was flourishing at the time. And one of the key issues concerning European powers and just European households at the start of the 17th century was how to preserve your meat.
Oh, yeah, so it's not all about flavours. It's about preservation.
That was definitely part of it. Flavouring your meat was pretty good. It was partly just to cover the tang of rotten flesh.
Yeah.
But it was also a bit of a symbol of luxury and status. And
So you're telling me they just weren't whacking it in the freezer?
no, so that was
No
a little way off. No freezers
fridges?
at the time. So like a
What are
lot
they
of the
doing?
meat that was hanging in a butcher's shop or in larders around Europe was literally rotting. Like from the moment it was carved up. They chucked a bit of salt on it, but if you...
On a side note, I was in Zanzibar once and I went to the street market and I've got a really good stomach. So I wanted a challenge. So I saw this bit of fish that had flies on it and I said, I want that one. I ate it
Well, that one.
and got violently ill. So
Zanzibar wins.
So turns out, preserving meat is a great idea.
Yeah, I think that your story mostly shows your idiocy.
Yeah.
That is ludicrous.
I was confident. I was confident in my own body.
That is ludicrous.
It let me down.
Anyway. Yeah, so the spice trade, was flourishing at the time. It's not that it was new for Europe. Spice had been around since the days of the Romans. But it was always really expensive, partly because of how hard it was to come by, and that was partly because of how far away it came from.
It was basically on the other side of the world, wasn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. Very close to. It had to travel a really long way. It had to travel through a lot of different hands.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of risk involved in moving that sort of valuable cargo that far. For many of the people who lived in Europe at the time, like you mentioned, the other side of the world, but they had no idea where it came from. A lot of them still believed it came from these mythical islands.
The corner shop.
Yeah, well, some people thought it came from the Garden of Eden.
Oh, that's nice.
They didn't know exactly where it was going to come from, but there were stories of these incredible valleys and right at the end of the world. In reality, many of the spices came from India and ports in India, from Sri Lanka and islands around what is now Indonesia.
A lot of people make the joke that Britain spent hundreds of years kind of conquering the world to get these spices, and then yet their food's still really bland 500 years later.
To this day. They're still struggling with it.
What was the point?
Yeah.
You don't even use the spices in your food.
Yeah. So I mentioned the Romans, as sort of opening up that spice trade in the early days, but after them, Arab and Persian traders managed to bring it over from India all the way through.
Like the Silk Road.
Yeah, similar kind of spice road. It wasn't nearly as big of a deal as the
road
Silk
full
Road.
of spice.
Yeah. And most of those merchants, so like the Arab and Persian merchants and all of the spice that was traveling across from India ended up at the ports of European cities. And the most notable of these was Venice. But those places became super valuable because that was the gateway through to the rest of Europe.
Basically, if you visit a city in Europe that's got a whole lot of fancy buildings, it's either built on slavery or on the spice trade.
Why not both?
Yeah, Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Both.
So, as I mentioned before, one of the reasons for the really high cost of spices in Europe, which were vital if you wanted a nice meal or to prove that you were a bit fancy and upper class or just to hide the tang of your rotten meat, they had to pass through so many hands to get to your table. So, understandably, a lot of Europe wanted to cut out some of the middlemen.
Yeah, fair.
A lot of those traders who were carrying it from India all the way across, maybe they could be cut out. And in 1488, Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope.
Yes.
Went around the bottom of Africa, and in doing so, he opened up the oceanic rather than just the land route through to the Indian Ocean. So all of a sudden, Europe wasn't dependent on that overland journey.
Yeah.
They had access via the sea. That's one part of the problem solved. But the potential of that oceanic route wasn't fully realised for 11 years when the big dog, Vasco da Gama, he went around the Cape of Good Hope, obviously, but he also plugged directly into the European spice trade by setting up a port on the Indian coast.
Nice.
So the early 1500s,
Yeah.
the Portuguese move. They've got this foothold. They move to consolidate that by building fortified ports all the way along the coast of Africa, as well as India and Malacca at the time. And
They basically had a monopoly, didn't they?
well, yeah, I mean, at first they didn't really know exactly where to go still.
Yeah.
They needed to use that old double barrel of like diplomacy and violence to be able to figure out exactly where to go. But they did eventually find the real like, non-mythical locations of the fabled Spice Islands.
Yeah.
And once they'd done that, they moved to regulate the market. So there was a system called the Cartaz, which was basically a system of regulated permits in terms of who could trade at the various ports and for what goods. And that was backed up by a pretty well-armed naval force. So as a result of Portuguese action here, the spice trade sort of slowly moves away from those Italian cities of Venice and Genoa through the Strait of Gibraltar and all the way around to Lisbon.
Yeah.
To tie that back into our central story, we've got to remember that at this point, the Dutch Republic, those
Freaky deaky Dutch.
upstart northern provinces,
Yeah.
are hard at work resisting Spain, but remember they're also resisting Portugal at the same time.
Yes.
So in terms of the spice trade, which is obviously going to be really appealing to any merchant in Europe at the time,
Yeah.
and the Dutch Republic was teeming with merchants.
Oh,
they loved to build a ship.
They love their merchants.
Absolutely loved it. But all of this Portuguese action meant that the Dutch were essentially locked out of that burgeoning spice trade.
Dang.
Yeah, which is tough. It's a pretty well-regulated trade network by the Portuguese, and there's no real way in.
And how the heck are you going to get into heaven
If
if you can't
you
get in on
can't
the spice money?
get a bit of profit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an existential, salvational crisis for the Dutch. But if there's one thing the Dutch are good at, it's being
Total football.
stubborn. Yeah, very good at moving all over the pitch.
Yeah.
But they're also good at being a bit stubborn and direct.
Yeah.
And so over time and through sheer persistence, a little bit of skullduggery, they managed to gain knowledge of the Portuguese routes, which were stored on these maps
drives.
known
Maps.
as rutters.
Yeah.
And they even hired a few Portuguese pilots who were keen to jump ship, so to speak. And so the Dutch were able to start financing some early voyages themselves
Nice.
into the Indian Ocean,
Just testing the water.
testing the waters, seeing what it's like. Is there a piece of the pie that they can cut off for themselves? So 1595 to 1597
Yes.
is the window of that first Dutch fleet. It's a spice voyage. It's off to Java, and it didn't go as smoothly as they'd probably hoped. When they first arrived in the Javanese port of Bantam, the Dutch were asked to pay a little bit more than they had expected.
Oh.
So all of a sudden their profit margin was shrunk, and they responded as, any rational person would. They used all of their cannons to open fire on the town.
That's what you do when you don't like a price.
That's what Europeans do. Yeah,
Yeah.
let's just use force very quickly. Maybe there was a bit of karma at work, though, because at the next port, one of the ships, Amsterdam, was boarded and 12 of its crew members were hacked to death.
Oh.
You reap what you sow a little bit. And I think those first two stops on the route probably made them a little jumpy
Yeah.
when they pulled into their next port. And when they did that, the locals seemed a little bit too friendly. The Dutch was suspicious. And so rather than be betrayed, because that's embarrassing,
Yeah.
they opened fire on the prince's welcoming party.
Yeah. You act first.
Yeah, that's it. You seize the initiative.
Yeah.
It's a power move. And whether or not they've made the right move or the wrong move, we'll never know.
Just some friendly locals.
Yeah.
Coming on board to play some chess.
It's so hard to say. Anyway, that fleet eventually gets back with just enough spice to cover their costs. They've only got about 1/3 of the original crew
So you're telling
who
me they
departed.
came back, half the crew's dead.
2/3
and we
of the crew's dead.
We just broke even.
Yeah, basically.
Sorry, you're not getting paid. We've just paid our costs.
Yeah, so those people probably weren't going to heaven. But
Dang.
they at least knew where the Spice Islands were now. They didn't have a complete understanding of the picture. They didn't have total, charts of the area or anything like that at this point. But they got there and they got back.
Yeah.
So
that
that's
might be like halfway to heaven.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, he's stuck in purgatory.
Yeah.
It's a foot in the door. So after that foot in the door, they kept wedging themselves in a little bit further, and they got a little bit better over time. well, they actually got a lot better. After 1611, which is jumping ahead a little bit in the story,
Yeah.
a guy called Hendrik Brouwer wondered what would happen if, after passing the Cape of Good Hope, he didn't sort of head north-northeast and keep hugging the coast of Africa.
Yeah, because apparently it was pretty slow, eh?
Yeah. What if you just kept going? Like, don't turn north.
What's out there?
Keep going. Well, turns out there's some pretty roaring trade winds.
Oh, mate, if he gets into the roaring 40s.
He found them.
Oh.
He found the roaring 40s.
Mate,
So
I could have
those,
told him that. I said, stay down there, mate. That's where the good wind is.
yeah. So those winds, which were relentlessly strong, they cut the travel the travel time from like the Dutch Republic all the way through to the Spice Islands by about half.
I mean, we know the wind basically just roars around and then hits Wanaka.
Yeah, we cop it full bore.
Yeah.
But one key point to make, though, about that travel time being cut in half is that not only does your rate of trade increase because you're getting there and back, in double time, but your crew the whole way is a hell of a lot healthier.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Less time, less scurvy.
Yeah. So all in all, it's an absolutely massive win.
But you are miles from land, so, if anything goes wrong.
Yeah, there's definitely one major drawback, which we'll cover a little bit later in the story. Yeah. So it's not all plain sailing.
So they go straight east from the Cape of Good Hope.
Yep.
And basically the next land they'll hit is Australia.
Yeah, they're just hooning towards Australia.
Yeah,
and so they've got to turn north at some point.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we'll cover some of the dangers around exactly when you're supposed to turn north a little bit later on. Like I said, that was a little bit ahead of my story because we were still sort of at the turn of the century, like late 1500s at this point. And one of the main problems after the Dutch had their foot in the door was that there were a whole bunch of competing merchants going after the same stock.
Yes.
And to some extent, healthy competition's great for capitalism, especially for the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, all it meant from like the business owner's point of view was that the competition was undercutting each other, and they were all doing this against the combined might of the Spanish and the Portuguese. So they probably needed a bit of a better system if they were going to take advantage of this incredibly lucrative spice market.
Yes.
Maybe they needed to put aside some differences and band together, and I think you're going to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like you said, at this time there was a ton of independent Dutch merchants trying to get in there, but the problem was they were competing fiercely with each other, and they were bidding up their prices against each other and lowering profits for everyone. And they worked out pretty quickly, if they keep doing this, then their rivals like Portugal and also England, who was getting amongst it, were just going to crush them. So the Dutch government decided, what if we combine our forces? So they got all these rival merchants to combine into one company. And in 1602, this became what's called the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. Which is what we're going to refer to it as. And this became one of the world's most powerful companies because suddenly these guys were all working together. Now that they had the keys to the spice trade, they could work together and really get amongst it.
Stick it to those filthy Portuguese rats.
Yeah.
And the English, like you said, who I didn't mention, but yeah, they were having fingers in the pies.
I mean, they had their own English East India Company as well,
Yep.
which had been set up a couple of years before. So now that the Dutch merchants were all together in the VOC, this allowed investors to share both the risk, which would be minimised, and the profits, which would be maximised.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing about the VOC is that it was one of the first multinational companies in history because it allowed independent people to invest in the company, and then they would get a share in the profits through dividends. And it's kind of like the first company that looks like what our companies look like today.
Yeah, it's like a big corporation. Like when you say multinational, I suppose it's multi-province.
Yeah, but there was also people outside of the Dutch provinces that invested in the VOC.
Yep.
And the great thing is they were able to pool all their money, all their ships, and just create this one company that could just dominate Asian trade. And it actually ended up becoming more powerful than a lot of countries, the VOC. This is because the Dutch government allowed them to do things like build forts. Mm-hmm. They were allowed to wage war. They were allowed to maintain private armies. This is a company with their own little armies. They were able to control territory. They had their own like justice system with their own courts.
Yep.
They were allowed to execute people.
Yep.
They basically became a state within a state.
Yeah, and like if they claimed territories as well, they could claim them for the company.
Yeah. But the thing to remember about the Dutch East India Company is that they did some amazing trips all around the world in this kind of early time of exploration and discovery, but they weren't that interested in finding new land.
No.
The only thing that mattered to them
Getting into heaven.
was profit.
Yeah, same thing.
So if the land had money, then great.
Yep.
But if there was no like money to be made on this land that they found, who cares? Move on.
Keep sailing.
And they had that kind of Calvinistic religious background, but there was this unofficial motto which sums up the VOC quite nicely, and it is, Jesus Christ is good, but trade is better.
Yeah.
Which,
it's one and the same thing, to be honest, so it's not even blasphemous.
There was actually a Dutch West India Company, but they were a little bit different because they went to West Africa and then picked up some slaves, went to the Caribbean and sold them. And they made a lot of money that way, but that was a completely different company that dominated the Western Hemisphere.
Yep.
But we're going to be focusing on the Dutch East India Company.
Yep, the VOC.
The VOC. The VOC, its goal was basically they need to make as much money as possible so that everyone can get to heaven, you know?
Yeah.
They worked out that...
maybe they could live comfortably in the meantime, you know?
Yeah.
Just as it's just a nice little side effect.
In order to make as much money as possible, they realized that they needed to have a pretty good base in Asia, because you said before, like they were getting kind of fleeced every time they pulled up. And so they decided that they needed to set up their own little port. And in that way, they could control the spice routes, especially when they get to that kind of like Indonesia, India, the Spice Islands.
Yep.
So this is where the city of Batavia comes into it. So in 1619, the Dutch founded this city called Batavia. What they did is they found this really nice port that already existed.
Beautiful.
It was called Jakarta. And they thought, this is a really nice harbour where our ships can come in. Why don't we just destroy what's already here? So they came in, guns a-blazing.
For God.
Knocked over all the locals' port and built essentially their own city in the island of Java. And the reason for that, it was very strategic, is because it was kind of all the ships that were going to the Spice Islands had to pass through this kind of strait.
Yep.
So perfect location to be able to defend all your ships and, make as much money as possible. So this was to become the headquarters of the VOC in Asia, and it was the capital of their empire, and it was essentially the centre of Dutch power in the East Indies.
Yep.
Every VO ship leaving Europe was basically heading first to Batavia and then off to the Spice Islands to get their kind of spice.
Or to India, like that, wherever they were going, they stopped through Batavia first.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about Batavia because it's a pretty interesting place. It was designed to look like a Dutch city. So even though it's set in the tropics, it had like these stone walls and forts. They built all these canals, just like Amsterdam, because obviously they'd worked out that canals is such an efficient way to transport stuff around the city. If you ever visit any city like Bruges or Amsterdam, you can see the canals are so cool.
Yep.
They had European style houses, and they had this massive central fortress called the Castle of Batavia. So now if you go to Jakarta, whereas Batavia was, you can still find the odd little stone wall from when Batavia was owned by the Dutch.
Yep.
But one issue that they had is the Dutch believed that they could control nature, essentially, and they thought they could do exactly what they've done back home in the Dutch provinces. And that is, they thought, we'll drain all the swamps, we'll manage the water, and we'll put in all these awesome canals, because it's worked really well in Europe, right?
Yeah.
But this was a pretty fatal mistake, because they were now in the tropics. And with the tropical heat, the canals essentially became a stagnant breeding ground for mosquitoes, which led to a lot of disease.
Yeah.
There's lots of malaria, dysentery, and quite a bit of typhoid, and it just killed thousands. Batavia basically got this grim reputation of being called the graveyard of Europeans.
Yeah. I think, like, the VOC soldiers or anyone that ended up there, like, average life expectancy was something like 3 years.
Yeah. And like they just couldn't get their head around, like, why isn't this working? It works so well in Amsterdam. Why aren't these canals, like, no one understood, like, it's a completely different climate and the fact that mosquitoes love water. So they were just...
But that stupidity even comes down to the way that they would dress. Like, they'd still wear their heavy woolen coats in the middle of this tropical mosquito-ridden swamp fest.
And I mean, the locals obviously had a natural immunity to all this stuff, so it affected the Europeans, especially the Dutch, a whole lot more. So there's lots of examples, which I'm going to talk about, of how people visiting Batavia have a pretty terrible time. So it's not all tropical paradise over here in the Spice Islands.
No, but it's worth it for the profit.
Yeah. So who lived in Batavia? Well, it was one of the most diverse cities in Asia, but it was pretty unequal, which is, typical
of the time.
European exploration. It included a whole bunch of Dutch VOC officials and soldiers. There was a bunch of Chinese merchants, Indian traders, Southeast Asian sailors, and local Javanese people. Let's not forget the Dutch have come in and people were already there.
I bet they were annoying.
And there was also a whole bunch of enslaved people that have been brought over from Asia and Africa.
Naturally.
Obviously, we talked before about the slaves in
You're not going to
West
build
Africa.
something like that on your own.
Yeah. So
Too sweaty.
it was only a small percentage of the population in the city that was actually Dutch, but they held all the power. Society was strictly divided by race, class, and legal status, and the VOC ruled absolutely. The company was in charge. It wasn't the Dutch Republic. It was the company, and they had the jurisdiction to do whatever they wanted.
As much as Calvinism sort of gets away from that top-down hierarchical, approach of Catholicism, the VOC were pretty top-down and heavy-handed. Like their word was law.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and Batavia worked so well is because it was perfectly positioned for trade. It was on the north coast of Java, near the Sunda Strait, which is the key passage that links the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, right? And it was close to all the major trading routes linking India, China, Southeast Asia, essentially the hub for the spice trade.
It's pretty good for an upstart little republic.
Yeah, and it was within reach of the Spice Islands, which were just down the line.
Score.
And this is where the spices are like nutmeg, cloves, mace. These are all like the most valuable commodities in the world.
Bit of cinnamon.
Yeah.
Cinnamon toast back home.
All the big ones. None of that existed in Europe until they kind of got amongst the Spice Islands. So from Batavia, the VOC could, control shipping lanes. They stored all their goods. They could also launch military expeditions and, more importantly, enforce trade monopolies through violence.
Yes, get closer to God.
So what they would do is essentially from Europe, they would send boats over with a whole bunch of silver coins, and then they would buy the spice, buy the Asian goods, and then they would ship it back to Europe and make a shitload of money.
Yeah, in real quick time.
Yeah. Staggering profits,
Like 1,000% returns.
Especially if you've got a monopoly.
Yeah.
You can charge whatever you want, right?
Yeah, and like you said, any losses, the risk is spread among everybody. So your personal loss there is minimized.
Yeah, so it sounds like a pretty sweet, business plan. It sounds pretty easy, right? But you've got to remember, Batavia it's a dangerous place, purely because of all the disease that was going on.
Well, it's dangerous for the people going there. It's not dangerous for the VOC officials, right? Like, so this company's headed by the gentleman 17, the Heeren 17.
Yeah.
These 17 big dogs. Their level of personal risk is very low.
Yeah. But I guess everyone that's going on these trips, they're trying to up their status, up their kind of wealth.
Yeah, good on them if
this
they
is
make
a
it.
This is a way, getting on one of these boats is a way of them moving up in the world, essentially.
Hopefully,
and potentially getting to heaven.
Hooray.
But just to demonstrate how deadly it was to stop in Batavia, I don't know if you've heard of this guy called James Cook.
No.
He came to New Zealand once back in the day, 1769.
Okay.
The first time.
I wasn't around then.
And after he'd kind of discovered New Zealand, been around there, then he went on to Australia, and he damaged his boat a little bit on the Great Barrier Reef by ramming it in there.
Was he not a very good sailor?
Oh, he was pretty good.
Oh.
But anyway, he obviously worked out he needed to fix his ship. So what better place to fix his ship than Batavia? So he thought, I'll call in Batavia on my way back to Britain with after these amazing discoveries. And once he got to Batavia, 30 of his crew died.
Right.
Up until that stage.
He kept everyone safe.
No sailors had died from disease on his whole trip.
Yeah.
He'd kept scurvy at bay. He was so proud of the fact that his crew was healthy. Stops in it, apparently, is this European port in Asia, and 30 people die, including Tupaya, which was this Tahitian navigator that he picked up to help communicate with the Māori in New Zealand.
Yep.
So that's really, really sad in that Tupaya was buried in this horrible city.
Bit of a cesspit. We hate the place.
Yeah. A couple of decades later, this character called William Bligh, you might have heard of him.
Starchy fella.
He stopped in Batavia on the way to Tahiti before the mutiny.
Yep.
And then afterwards, after his 3,600-mile journey in his boat that he had to row through the open ocean, they ended up coming back to Batavia after stopping in Kopang.
Little side note, I was on Norfolk Island recently for a few weeks.
Yes.
Stopped by the Bounty Museum and had a look at a replica of Bligh's longboat. That thing is tiny.
Yeah.
Like, you hear the dimensions of it, the measurements of it, and the distance that he had to sail, and it's staggering. But when you actually see it, he did all right, Bligh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they survived all that time, get to Batavia, and several of his crew just die straight away.
Yeah.
Imagine surviving like that long on that boat and being like, man, this is going to be the most amazing story.
Hooking into albatrosses.
And then just pulling up to this kind of supposed safe city and just getting dysentery and dying.
Yep.
But another interesting character that actually lived in Batavia was this guy called Abel Tasman.
Mm-hmm.
You heard of him?
Dutch bloke.
Yeah. And he was part of the VOC. He lived and worked in Batavia throughout the 1630s and 1640s, so just after our story, actually. Mm-hmm. And he was a VOC navigator. While he was in Batavia, he married, he built his career, and he gained a reputation as a really skilled sailor. And from Batavia, the VOC kind of planned and launched expeditions. But they weren't expeditions of discovery to be like, I wonder what's down there, let's go discover. They were looking for places where they could potentially make some money. So Tasman was sent out to see if there was any more kind of like interesting, profitable lands out there. And in December 1642, he became the first European to reach New Zealand. He anchored near Golden Bay, but he never actually set foot on land because what happened when he was there is that some local Māori approached their boat in a waka. There was no shared language or any kind of understanding of intentions, and unfortunately the next day a clash occurred and 4 Dutch sailors were killed. Tasman fired the cannons immediately and just got out of there.
Took off.
Yep. And that place was called Murderer's Bay. He continued north, mapping the coastline, but he kind of worked out that there was no obvious wealth in that country.
From the ocean.
Which remains true to this day.
Yeah.
There was no spices, there was no gold. Joke's on him, but there's a little bit of gold. So the VOC didn't seem that interested in New Zealand, and it was ignored for more than 120 years before old Captain Cook arrived in 1769. So that was interesting, as that's where Abel Tasman kind of launched from.
Mm-hmm.
But that is Batavia, this kind of cesspool of disease, but massive,
vital trading hub,
massive like way to make money, because that's where all the ships go. So I guess our story that we're going to talk about with over these next few episodes really begins with this fleet of ships of the VOC that are heading to the city of Batavia.
Yep.
Just like I said before, they're getting loaded up with money to take to Batavia to buy a whole bunch of spices to bring back to make some staggering profits.
Heaps of money is being loaded.
Yeah, a lot of money. And just to make it real confusing, the freaky deaky Dutch decided to name the flagship Batavia. Mm-hmm. So we've got Batavia the city, but we're going to be focusing on Batavia the ship, because that is where all the action is going to happen. So the Batavia, just briefly, is about 45 meters long. It was loaded up with cannons, and it was designed to carry money, a whole bunch of money, also some cargo, and also some people. So on some of the people were like the VOC officials, obviously, some soldiers to protect them, the sailors, and then there was a whole bunch of women and children, because part of these trips, the idea was to take the women and children over to Batavia so that the VOC officials there can marry and have kids, and they can actually like create this whole society over there and not just have a massive sausage fest of blokes getting frustrated because they don't have any women.
Run out of slave girls.
So to talk about the flagship Batavia, in late 1628, 11 Dutch ships were prepared to sail, but one stood above the rest, and this was this ship called the Batavia. It was the flagship, and it was crafted for more than a year, and it was ready to make its maiden voyage. It was 165 feet long, and it had 3 massive masts with 9,000 square feet of sail. So if you think of like the boat that Christopher Columbus sailed to America on, Santa Maria, Batavia was like 3 times as big as this. So it was a massive, massive ship. Cost about 100,000 guilders, which is like $15 million today.
Crikey dicks.
Seems quite cheap these days for a big ship, but at the time, like they had spent a ton of money creating this ship. So it was like the pride of the VOC. Here it is, the Batavia. This is going to kind of like show our glamour and our power as we head over to this city.
Big carved lion on the front of it, you know, showing everybody that they meant business.
Yeah, and it was about to embark on this kind of 9-month journey to the East Indies, because that's how long it took. I actually went to the Maritime Museum in Amsterdam last year as research for this pod, and they do have like this East Indiaman ship that you can get on and walk around. And even though we're talking about how glamorous this ship was, the living conditions, you know, they're very cramped.
Yeah, it's not
good.
good.
You're bent over when you're walking around, like it's between the floors, like you can't even stand straight up. There's not much space at all.
Yep.
It's designed to carry cargo, to carry money.
Yep.
And
there were 340 people on this ship, right? Like it was packed to the gills.
Yeah. So it wasn't just a trading ship, it was part of a colonial system, moving families, administrators and settlers to Asia. The Batavia carried one of the richest cargoes ever assembled, including massive quantities of silver coins, and this was going to be used to buy all the spices. So let me introduce some of the main players that are going to be on this ship, and these are kind of like our key characters for the story. So the person that was in charge, the highest ranking VOC official, was a chap by the name of Francisco Palsard. He was this quietly spoken guy. He had long black hair and this nicely coiffed goatee beard.
Yep.
So, you know,
typical for the time.
If you think of a Dutch person, it's basically
that
basically
guy.
him. He was from Antwerp in the southern Netherlands, and he was a very intelligent guy.
Wait, he was from Antwerp. Was he Catholic?
He was Catholic.
That's not all right.
And we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay, sorry, that's not all right.
He had a lot of courage, because when he was young, in his 20s, he headed over to the East Indies, and you know, he knew that it was pretty deadly. He knew there was a lot of risks, but he thought this was my way of making it in the world, rising up the ranks, etc., etc. And because he was an intelligent guy, he was able to kind of sort stuff out. He was able to work with the locals. He was really smart with his maths and working out how to make maximum profit. And he did really well with the company. And he started to advance remarkably quickly. But this was despite the fact that he was a Catholic in a Protestant company, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because the VOC required their officers at least to be Protestant.
Yeah, but apparently the fact that he was Catholic could be forgiven because he was making them a lot of money.
Right, okay, loophole.
So, I mean, I don't know how strictly Catholic he was. Maybe he buried it a bit.
Yeah, I think he did in the beginning. Like, he just left that out of his application. And then he did well enough anyway that it was like, we'll just let him hang around.
Yeah, he's good at making money.
Yeah.
So he was on this upward trajectory through the ranks. It was so startlingly rapid that it was without precedent that he moved up. So Palsard worked for 10 years in India, and he kind of worked his way around the Spice Islands, and he showed this massive capacity with numbers and people, and he moved himself up to the rank of senior merchant. During his time in East India, the profits flowed. Which is very important.
I read in Mike Dash's book that it was something like he instinctively understood the need to impress the people of the Indian Mogul courts by living this like ostentatious, big, extravagant lifestyle. But I think that maybe he just liked living a fancy life.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. Who doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, it did seem to work. My God, I live in extravagance.
Yeah. The only one problem so far is he hasn't been able to find a wife, which is a shame.
Does he not have any success with the ladies?
Well, no. He takes the company of many local ladies, including some in the Mogul courts.
Francisco.
So he's obviously, his coiffed goatee.
Yeah, it's doing the trick.
The ladies love that stuff.
Those flowing locks.
At the end of his kind of 10th year of being in India in the Spice Islands, he got malaria and got pretty seriously ill. Like, he was cooked. And he decided, it's time to get back to Europe just to like get my health back. He'd done pretty well, and he vowed that when he left, he's never going to return. You know?
Yep.
I've
Why
had
would
enough-
you?
he almost died.
Yeah,
from
he's
it.
done his time.
And the thing is, once you get malaria once, you're like more vulnerable to it, eh?
Yeah.
So he jumped on the ship back to Amsterdam, and while he's on that ship, he met another one of our main characters, and that is Arian Jacobs.
Mm-hmm.
Jacobs is like he's a skipper, and he's very different to Palsart in that he's a true salty dog.
Yeah.
He is like the ultimate in rough sailors.
A little less refined and diplomatic.
Fitzsimons calls him a rakish mariner.
Right. Yeah, okay.
His principal passion was whoring.
Oh, we've all been there.
He had no particular loyalty to anything. He especially did not like VOC officials.
Right.
He detested like authority. He hated them as a matter of principle.
Sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Jacobs was friends with men known around the bars and brothels by names such as Scarface and Hook.
Yeah.
If he had any artistic side, it was evident only in the creative way he rearranged the physical features of other men's faces, while they often did the same to him just before they died.
That's great stuff from Fitzsimons.
That's how Fitzsimons put it. So hopefully it's painting the picture of just this really rough as guts. He's a big unit too, like you wouldn't muck around with him.
In stark contrast to the finely boned Palsart.
Yeah, well, Fitzsimons puts it this way. Palsart, a refined, diminutive man with a passion for music, had roughly the same physical proportions as Jacob's left leg.
Okay, yep.
So there's a bit of difference in kind of like physical size there
Yep.
and intelligence, and also a big difference in kind of position,
Yeah.
right? So Palsart's the high official, he's the in charge, the commander, and Jacobs is the skipper. He's in charge of the boat, he's in charge of like sailing the boat, but that's it.
Yep.
As it turned out, both these two boys took a dislike to each other immediately.
Mm-hmm. They were either going to be best mates or firm enemies.
This is on the way back from, the Spice Islands.
Yep.
This started when Palsart expressed his fierce outrage to discover that Jacobs was engaging in private commerce.
What?
He was doing a little bit of dodgy dealing on the side,
Under the table.
which is strictly forbidden by the VOC. Everything has to go through them so they can take their cut, right?
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, but I've got a few issues with Palsart and his like high and mighty.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if he was as squeaky clean as he makes out here.
Yeah, well, I mean, most of our material is coming from his journals, isn't it? So he's,
Yeah, that's a good point to make, is that a lot of the content that we've got comes from his journals. There's some bias there. Another thing to mention too is that before he left the Mogul court, where he was stationed for a long time, like you mentioned that he was well known to some of the local ladies, but he took up with one of the wives of one of the Moguls, and their relationship progressed to the point that she came around to his place one night. They're hitting it off great. She picks up a jar of what she thinks to be wine. Turns out it's oil of clove, and she just absolutely downs it and drops dead, like at his feet. And so he sweeps the whole thing under the rug, like buries her body.
under the rug.
Well, so to speak.
What's this big bump in your rug here? So, nothing to see here.
Yeah, but he manages to get away with it. And that's sort of when he gets out as well. So it's not like he's not as goody two-shoes as he makes out. He also...
But what about his goatee beard?
Yeah, I know that it's all for show. It makes him seem like a proper gentleman.
Yeah.
Because he was also taking loans at the time and charging people like 18% interest. And, he was pretty good in chasing
Sounds like he's
them down.
running a good system there.
Yeah, like the VOC in many ways would have been pretty proud of him, showing initiative and all of that.
Yeah.
But, when he's hooking into Jacobs on this trip and,
Yeah.
I
A
don't
little
know,
bit
man.
hypocritical, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, he didn't tell her to drink the clove of oil, though, did
No,
he?
he didn't. Like, it wasn't
said,
premeditated
Here,
murder.
drink this.
No, but he did have skeletons in the closet because one of the merchants in India, found out about it and actually blackmailed the VOC to state that we know what your merchant has done.
Yeah.
So
And it was time to leave.
time to leave. Yeah.
So anyway, these lads are on their ship back to Amsterdam, back to the Dutch Republic. It all goes well, but by the end of it, they hate each other so much that Palsart is adamant he never wants to see him again.
Okay. Oh, well, it's a big world. They'll probably
so that's
go
all
their
good.
separate ways.
They didn't kill each other.
Sweet.
They got to Amsterdam.
Yep.
All is well. Until this amazing opportunity comes up. And if the one thing we know about Palsart He loves a bit of cash.
Yeah, he'll sniff it out.
So this opportunity to be the commander of this fleet with the ship of Batavia as the flagship comes up. And Pausad thinks, you know how I vowed never to go back to East India? Well,
I've had a bit of time away.
Yeah.
Oh, it was probably rash.
Yeah. So he jumps back on as commander, and to his horror, he finds out that Jacobs has been made the skipper.
Yeah, of his ship.
Of his ship. Not any of the others in the fleet, but his one.
Yeah.
So already before we leave on this journey, this 9-month journey, there's some pretty good tension brewing between two of the main lads.
It's important, I guess, to
voyage.
note that like Jacobs being the skipper of the Batavia is a testament to his ability.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't giving the role of pilot, skipper of the flagship to any old sea dog.
Yeah.
This guy was really good at what he did.
Yeah, I mean, Pausat, one of the reasons he's so motivated to do this trip as opposed to just staying at home and finding locals to be with is he's got a chest full of 4 bags of jewels.
Mm-hmm.
He's also got this extremely valuable foot-long like carving. It's like a cameo that's over 1,000 years old. It comes from the Eastern Roman Empire and was created in like the 4th century. And it's rumoured to be owned by the great Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens.
Oh, your mate.
Yeah, and this famous Amsterdam jeweller. And Pausat thinks he will likely find favour at the Mogul court, and he'll be able to sell it and make at least 50% profit on this bad boy. So, you know, the dollar signs are just stacking up in his head. So all he's thinking is like, oh, this is going to be a painful trip, but if I can make it work, I'm going to come back and just, I'm guaranteed
set for life,
go to heaven.
Generational wealth.
Even though I'm a Catholic.
Yeah. And that lady died. And
so that was kind of where we're at. We've got Pausat at command. We've got Jacobs, the skipper.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you introduce some of the other characters that are going to be on this big trip of Batavia?
Yeah, so I think as the voyage really sets off and they're on open water, we'll meet a few of the other characters and we might discuss a bit more about what life was like on the ship. But a couple of the other principal characters, apart from the upper merchant Pausat, the skipper Jacobs, is the under merchant Euronymous Cornelis.
Euronymous.
That guy. So this is a bloke who was 30 by the time the ship sailed, but if we go all the way back to the beginning, because he's a complex character and you've really got to unpick maybe why he ends up doing the things that he does. He started his life in Friesland, which is one of the most northern provinces of the Dutch Republic.
Yes.
And it was isolated from the more southern of those northern states by a bunch of peat bogs and marshes and like swamps. So people didn't really go in there unless they had a real important job to do.
Yeah.
So very isolated, very protected. And many from that part of the country disliked the mainstream Dutch. Like they thought of themselves as certainly a very different, maybe more ancient people. And many in Friesland didn't even speak Dutch itself. So in his early days, Euronymous is raised in that somewhat different, isolated sort of climate.
Kind of like Shrek in the swamp.
A little bit like Shrek, yeah. But he didn't have the comic relief of Donkey. So I think he was a little bit more set in his ways.
Yeah.
He was probably raised as an Anabaptist. Which would mean he had quite a different view of the world and what was important than the rest of the Calvinist North.
Yeah.
The Anabaptists believe, among other things, for a pretty strict separation of church and state, so less church meddling in state affairs.
Yep.
The existence of free will, which is a pretty big one.
Oh, that's
in
nice.
that you can sort of dictate the terms of your own life.
Yeah, I like
so
that.
it's a bit of an extension of that Calvinist individual streak in saying like, no, there's no predestination here. I've got my life and my fortune in my own hands. And part of that was this idea of credo baptism. So the idea that infants can't be baptized because they can't make like a conscious choice about faith or anything like that. So it's definitely a lot more about individual choice and the exercise of free will, which he certainly does a little bit later in our story.
Nice.
So all of those views, those Anabaptist views, definitely amount to heresy under both Catholicism and Calvinism. And there was a fair bit of heresy and like dark history in the Anabaptist past.
Oh, yeah.
One particularly dark chapter was the Munster Rebellion of 1534 to 35. So pretty violent episode in the German city of Munster when Anabaptist radicals seized control of it. And the leaders did what most leaders would do. They took a bunch of wives, which they okayed. They just ran the city as they saw fit until forces took back over of the city of Munster. They locked the leaders of this rebellion up in cages around the city. But one of the big sort of takeaways from this episode, and one of the things that's relevant to our story, is that the Anabaptists took a massive hit in terms of their reputation at this point. So whereas previously that existed with a fair degree of like religious autonomy and relatively well respected among the Dutch Republic, now they were sort of viewed as outcasts.
Yeah.
Because he came from a relatively well-off family, though, in this northern provinces, there's a good chance that Hieronymus went to a fancy Latin school at about the age of 10.
Hieronymus.
Yes, that guy. So after he'd finished his general schooling, went to this Latin school, and they're important because it might provide as well a bit of a clue to some of his later actions.
So he must be quite intelligent then.
Yeah, intelligent guy, and he was well schooled. Like, came from a bit of a unique place, unique religious views, and this Latin school probably honed those a little bit more because he would have got a fairly liberal education at this school.
Yeah.
So again, they taught the importance of things like critical thinking to some extent, like not necessarily just following the orders of those above you, but deciding for yourself, that exercise of free will.
Uh-huh.
So after he went through this pretty unique education in a unique little corner of the Dutch Republic, Hieronymus was apprenticed as an apothecary sometime between 1615 and 1620. His apprenticeship would have lasted for at least 3 years.
What's an apothecary?
I have no idea.
It's like a priest.
No. It's like at this time there were kind of 3 pillars to like medicine, I suppose, in the Dutch Republic.
Okay.
So you've got physicians, and there weren't many physicians around. And then there were surgeons, and then there were apothecaries as well.
And surgeons were basically just carrying a sword around and just whipping legs off.
Yeah. It's like in the hierarchy in terms of respect and social status, it was like physician and then apothecary and then surgeons at the bottom. So he was in the same like sort of social class, I suppose, as maybe like a lawyer or like he's middle to upper class. So the apothecaries, to be a little bit more specific, treated a really wide range of diseases. So you would get a referral from the physician, if you were lucky enough to see one, to an apothecary who would make you some sort of mixture or potion to try and help you out. Apothecaries had pretty much a monopoly on that preparation and supply of medicines, and they were treating things like plague and leprosy and typhoid and typhus and syphilis, tuberculosis, like just all
the big ones.
All the heavy hitters, yeah. Well, life was pretty tough at this time.
Yeah.
We've still got plague hanging around. COVID wasn't yet to rear its head, but yeah, cities were decimated by disease still. Like malaria, you mentioned, Pelsart contracting as well. And apothecaries would create their potions from a bunch of different plants.
Yeah.
There would almost always be an animal product as well chucked in there, and a little sprinkling of some metals sometimes. But apothecaries were also required to be familiar with things that you couldn't just pop down to the dairy and buy. As Mike Dash writes in Batavia's Graveyard, unicorn horn was greatly sought after. Excrement was widely prescribed.
I mean, I could get them some excrement, but I'm not sure about a unicorn horn.
No, I mean, just stick with what you can do. There's a market for it.
Yeah, okay.
If you can collect up some pigeon droppings,
Yeah.
they were a cure for epilepsy.
Oh, yeah.
And if you've got any dried wild boar penis lying around, if you're a little bit phlegmy, you got a bit much phlegm.
I'll just go whip one off.
Yeah, that'll reduce some of that phlegmy excess. Again, from Mike Dash, to modernise at least, the most unusual ingredient in an apothecary's store was mummy, ground human flesh, which was supposedly effective against almost every ailment from headaches all the way through to the bubonic plague. And the very finest mummy was supposed to come from the remains of men suffocated in a Saharan sandstorm.
Just going back to that wild boar penis.
I knew you were stuck on that. I could see it.
Well, I just read a thing saying Tyson Fury, the boxer,
big Manchester United fan,
tested positive for drugs, and his excuse was he ate some uncastrated wild boar, which put him over the limit.
Okay.
So maybe there is some truth to the powers of the wild boar penis.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that we should probably test out. We owe the listeners that much. All right, we'll hook into it. Medicines weren't the only thing that a Dutch apothecary would put together, though. They were members of the St. Nicholas Guild, which meant that they were also allowed to sell fruit pies and ginger cakes.
Oh,
so
what do they heal?
No, they just healed the soul.
Yeah.
If you wanted to go in for a bit of
Mental well-being.
poison, yeah, and a little mental pick-me-up, I deserve this. Get
Fruit
yourself
pie
a fruit
for
pie at the same time. So yeah, Euronymous was kind of your guy for everything.
Euronymous.
He set up his shop in Haarlem, in the province of Holland,
I've
which
been
you
through
mentioned
Haarlem.
earlier. Yeah, how was it?
Yeah, it's pretty boring.
Yeah, well, it
Maybe
was
stamps.
probably a bit more exciting in Euronymous' day because he had a stuffed crocodile hanging over his counter.
Oh, yeah, I didn't see that.
It wasn't that unusual at the time, to be honest. Like, apothecaries would often have some sort of exotic animal hanging there just to show that they were a bit worldly. They knew strange things that you didn't know. And crocodiles were apparently a pretty common one because of their leathery skin. They were pretty easy to preserve.
Yeah.
So he's got his career locked in. This is great. Well-educated, smart guy. Sometime in the 1620s, he turns to the next big thing to check off, and he marries a local girl named Belitgen
Oh, yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
And she gave birth to a baby boy in 1627.
Sounds like all's going well.
Seems like things are pretty good at this
Yeah.
time, and they're doing well enough.
Just like a normal guy.
Yeah,
living
beautiful, well-respected
Living his
couple.
life selling fruit pies.
Yeah, and, because they're doing well enough, they do hire a midwife, like somebody that can help them through the early pains of childbirth and child rearing.
That's nice, yeah.
She didn't do a great job, though.
Ah,
She apparently danced and sang compulsively. I don't know how much control she had over it or whether it just sort of broke out from time to time. She confessed to suffering from torments inside her head,
yeah.
which should be a red flag in the hiring process. She also slept with an axe beside her bed, so maybe some unresolved trauma there. And during Belitgen's labour, the midwife left part of the placenta in the new mother's womb, which is a no-no.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Take it out,
Yeah, get it out of there.
eat it, put it in the freezer,
Oh.
bury, I don't know, people bury it
Sell
under a
it?
tree. Yeah,
Yeah.
sell it if you want. Anyway, predictably, maybe, Belitgen got a little bit sick after having some of this placenta just left in there, and she found it a little bit difficult to care for her new son.
Yes.
But I want to make it very clear that she had no problem with milk production.
Oh, that's good to know.
Euronymous took care of that. He was a doting husband, and he hired a month or more before the baby's birth,
Yes.
and apparently it's fairly common at the time, an old woman to suckle at his wife's breasts.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
She get paid?
I believe
It's a
so.
voluntary role.
The wife? I think the old lady got paid, yeah. She was trying to stimulate the flow of milk just to make sure that, it makes total sense. If you can't provide a steady supply of milk, like these are not the days of formula from the supermarket, so it's a pretty important thing to do. Anyway, despite the efforts of her husband and the old woman suckling away, Belitgen's fever was burning a little bit too hot, and she was generally too sick to do much of anything, least of all child rearing.
Yeah.
So they hired a nurse to pick up some of the slack. Now, they had a bit of a misfire with the midwife, so you would think they would be a little bit more cautious when they're hiring
Man,
this
they
nurse.
need to work on their hires, eh?
Yeah, not the case. I thought that he was supposed to be intelligent, but at this point we meet Heiligken Janster, a woman of hot temper and low morals.
Perfect nurse
Direct
material.
quote from Mike Dash. She was known to cheat on her husband with a guy known in the community as Velvet Trousers, which can't read too much into that, but
Ricky Martin of his day.
it's pretty awesome that we know this guy's nickname this far down the line. I imagine him,
Yeah.
he would have no idea. Anyway, Velvet Trousers shows up and maybe contributes to a mysterious and long-term illness that this nurse has, which has symptoms that seem a lot like she might be syphilitic.
Oh.
So the fact that we know this in the 21st century means that Euronymous probably could have just asked around. In any case, the nurse did have one job, but in February of 1628, Euronymous had to bury his son,
Oh.
who mysteriously and, no doubt horribly, because it was a pretty terrible thing
Head
to
was
contract,
lopped off with an axe.
died of syphilis.
What are the
And
chances?
This is a problem for Euronymous and his wife, not just because their infant son has died, but because tongues would start wagging.
Yeah, Velvet Trousers is going to get it.
Yeah, rumours would abound among the community that the baby had contracted syphilis from the mother,
Yeah.
which in turn sort of implied that one or both of them had not been faithful in their marriage.
Oh,
And for a
Euronymous.
respectable couple, this is no good. So his reputation is absolutely tanking at this point.
Dang.
So he went after the nurse. He attempted to try and repair their reputation by saying, like, the crazy one who sleeps around with a guy called Velvet Trousers and has a mysterious illness, is perhaps the one who gave syphilis to our child. But she didn't take kindly to that and very loudly and publicly sort of assaulted the couple, and his name and the name of his wife was dragged through the mud, basically.
Yes.
So at this point, his apothecary business is not doing well.
Dang.
Partly because of that hit to the reputation, but partly because after a 12-year cease of open hostilities with Spain, that war has started back up again, and that's had really negative impacts on the economy.
Yep.
Massive depression, and so he's
no one's
struggling.
buying fruit pies.
Yeah, fruit pies are not high on the list of priorities. No so that's still flying off the shelves.
Oh, it is. Okay.
So while Euronymous at this point is close to broke, he's buried his son, all of that's happened, he wasn't entirely lost because he wasn't without friends.
That's nice.
Yeah, an important acquaintance of Euronymous was Johannes van der Beek, better known to history by the Latin version of his name, Torrentius.
Torrentius.
Now, he was one of the finest painters of his generation, very well known. He's considered a still life master. Not many of his paintings exist anymore, though, because of how much people hated the bloke and what he had to say.
Damn.
So I'm probably underselling it a little bit when I say that Torrentius was a controversial figure in his time.
Yeah.
It's well recorded that he claimed adultery was not a sin, totally fine, which at the time was absolutely outrageous. It's what brought Euronymous down in part. And he openly stated that he had half the whores of Holland at his personal disposal.
Outrageous.
So he was loud and proud and wasn't scared of saying things that other people would keep, sort of silent.
Donald Trump of his day.
Yeah. Perhaps unsurprisingly, his marriage didn't go all that well. Loud public fights with his wife, which ultimately brought their relationship to an end. And to paint another sort of chapter in Torrentius's backstory, when his marriage with his wife ended, rather than pay for her upkeep, which was traditional at the time, he just said, "Nah, send me to jail." It was a bit Muhammad Ali when he was conscripted during the Vietnam War, and he's just like, "Nah, take me to jail instead." So he was an unorthodox character, and after getting out of the slammer, he carried around the Dutch Republic, proceeding to get absolutely steamed, and would chat about all sorts of dodgy things.
Yeah.
He would apparently make toasts to the devil himself, and Mike Dash elaborates to say, Torrentius himself always claimed that many of his controversial comments had been meant as jokes. But even so, there is little doubt that by the standards of the day, he was a heretic. Torrentius insisted, for example, that there was no such place as hell, arguing that it was ridiculous to suppose there was, since it was well known there was nothing beneath the ground but earth. He told friends the scriptures were nothing but a collection of fables, a useful tool for keeping the population in check. He was overheard describing the Bible as the book of fools and jesters, and he even mocked the suffering of Christ.
Oh.
Absolute lunatic.
You can't do that.
There's some evidence as well to suggest that Torrentius lived his life according to the philosophies of the ancient Greek Epicurus, who basically said that the only way to live a good life is just to indulge in all of your pleasures. You just do whatever feels good.
Yeah.
That's the right thing that you should do.
It's not going to help sell your paintings, though, is it?
Well, they were pretty steamy. They were a lot of nude scenes, and
couple of nudes.
Yeah, he was eventually driven out of the Dutch Republic, but the English pardoned him and brought him over to England, where he proceeded to get steamed and say more things that turned people away from him. Yeah. So he was a controversial figure. To bring this back to Euronymous, though, one of the central characters of our story, acquaintance of Torrentius, lived a couple of 100 metres away. It's clear that he shared a bunch of Torrentius's musings on life. He stated that he didn't believe in heaven or hell, but he went one step further than that as well. It seems that one of Euronymous' central beliefs is that every single thing that he did in life was directly inspired by God. So essentially he believed that he was incapable of sin.
Oh, there's a big call.
It's a massive call, and it essentially leaves you free to do whatever you want, because you're stating anything that I think, anything that I do is a direct consequence of God's divine providence. So anything I do is God. He's doing that. So that's a pretty extreme philosophy for the time.
It's got a free pass, isn't it?
Yeah. From his Anabaptist roots through that Latin school where, again, they're teaching people to think for themselves. He's met with this free thinking, weird steamer, Torrentius.
Inspired him.
Yeah, in Harlem. And all of this has culminated in a character with a really unique personal philosophy who believes that he is incapable of sin.
Okay.
Dangerous. Yeah, dangerous character. And desperate too, right? Dangerous and desperate.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely down on his luck at this point. We've covered his downfall. So he's searching for a way to rebuild something out of the ashes of his life, and he walks into the offices of the VOC right as they're attempting to crew this ship of this fleet of 11 ships, I should say.
Yeah, and there's a lot of positions open, right?
Heaps of positions. And the VOC didn't really discriminate. Like, the people that they're putting on these boats are people who have no other real avenues of success.
Yeah, because it's pretty rough.
It's super rough. And like I said earlier, the chances of you surviving are slim.
Yeah.
Like a couple of years life expectancy, about a third of the people return. So if you're going, it's a last sort of throw of the dice.
Yeah.
But Euronymous isn't with the absolute rabble of this fleet. I think through a combination of his social pedigree, he's relatively well off up in the north, fancy education from his Latin school. And because he had that knowledge of spice, I mentioned that spices were important for food and social status, but they were also really important in the development of medicine and stuff. So as an apothecary, Euronymous had this good knowledge of what they're worth. And I guess he had some luck as well, like some good, some bad.
Yeah.
Through a combination of all of that, he ends up assigned the position of under merchant on the VOC flagship Batavia.
So he's just below Pelsart?
Just below Pelsart. Yeah.
Oh, so he's right up there.
He's right up there. So essentially, like in command, the VOC's top officials on this trip to Batavia, aboard the Batavia, plus the other 10 ships. We've got Pelsart as the upper merchant. We've got the under merchant in Euronymous, and we've got the skipper in Jacobs. One final person to mention before we wrap it up for this episode. Aboard the Batavia, hoisted aboard in a chair, a fancy chair.
Yeah.
This was not one of those lowlifes that were otherwise crewing the fleet. Was 27-year-old Lucretia Janstokter.
Lucretia.
Yeah, well, Lucretia. She's very different to Euronymous, described by Mike Dash as unusually beautiful and highborn, and by Peter Fitzsimons as possibly the most beautiful woman the crew have ever seen.
Oh, mate.
She's apparently super hot, which is partly why she got hoisted on board.
She's a brave woman going on a ship with all these...
Oh, absolute reprobates.
all the rogues.
And the womanizer, Euronymous, and we know that Jacobs
is bloody...
He loves his whoring.
He loves whoring.
Not that she's a whore. It's, you've mentioned that it's a bold move. It's probably a decision that she didn't make lightly, but due to the circumstances of her life, she also almost didn't really have a choice.
Yes.
She'd been an orphan since she was 11.
Okay.
And the small family that she'd started with her husband, who she'd married, I think when she was 17, he was now a VOC under merchant in the Spice Islands.
So he's living over there.
Yeah, he's living over there. So their small family had been shattered as one by one the 3 kids died.
Oh.
The last of the children probably died in late 1628. And so with essentially nothing left for her at home, no parents, her kids all died, she decided to sail to the ends of the earth to be with her beloved once again.
It seems a little bit irresponsible for the old husband just to go and live on the other side of the world while all his kids die.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't supposed to be forever, It was just a way of making money, like you said.
I'm just going to pop out for 9 months, couple years, 5 years. And
yeah, a few years.
I'll be back.
Yeah.
With malaria.
Yeah. I mean, all 3 children to die was unusual.
Yeah.
Like, that was a real tragedy. One other tragedy that, just a side mention is that her husband had actually already left Batavia. He'd been stationed somewhere else. But because the mail took so long to get back to the Dutch Republic,
she didn't get told.
She didn't know by the time the Batavia left. Like, she's sailing towards where she thinks he is, but he's not even there at that point. We don't actually know that much about him, but, this is the last throw of the dice for her. Like I said, befitting her status, she was individually hoisted aboard the ship, and she was given one of the fancy cabins alongside Pelsart.
Nice.
And there she settled in for a hopefully unremarkable journey. She was accompanied by a few chests of beautiful gowns and jewels and a lady's finery. And one other thing accompanying her on the journey was a maid who was not hoisted on the ship. She had to walk up.
Did she have to walk up?
Yeah, walked up all on her own,
Unbelievable.
dressed in a little black dress and a typical white cap and apron. And this maid's name was Zwancha. And the relationship between those two women, much like the relationship between Pelsart and Jacobs, got off to a pretty frosty start and just deteriorated from that point on.
Oh.
And that'll come up as a pretty important plot development later in our story.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of where we're going to wrap it up for this point.
Yeah, so we've kind of introduced the story. We've got the boat, Batavia. We've got the characters.
Hopefully we've set the scene a little bit in terms of the world, the stage that these characters are sort of acting out on. Because like we alluded to at the start, this beautiful flagship of the VOC's fleet is destined for absolute carnage and horror.
I'm sure it'll just all go to plan, won't it?
Oh, wait, what story are we telling? No, it's definitely the carnage and horror.
Oh, the carnage one, okay.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah.
So we'll pick up next episode with the ship leaving port and sailing off into the ocean for unimaginable profits.
Unimaginable.
/ unimaginable horror. Euronymous.
Signing out. Pacific Legends.
Unleashed.